There's many, many ways that we can help. Help create the space. Help get a venue for somebody to be able to hold something. Help create give some food, right? Like someone's doing an event, donate some food. Put people in the same space. And I find that time and time again, as Kivu and I were talking about this last night, is that like, folks are like, but why can't I be in your group? It's self-segregation. No, it is a response to the segregation and white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy, right, as Bell Hook talks about, the system that we live in. And we have to create space so we're able to organize and then be in space with community. This is like family counseling, right? When you're in a counseling setting, my consultant, my friend and co-conspirator, Paku, her talks about this, that like doing this work, it is like marriage counseling. You don't go to all your sessions with your partner. You do some together, but what do you got to do? What's the most important stuff? Your individual work, right? And so our communities need to have that space to do our individual work so we could be most effective when we're in spaces together. So for the Black and brown folk in particular in this room, you know, it's gonna be like church. I want y'all to get to know each other during lunch. Say hi, especially if you live here, because you're probably a token somewhere else. You're probably walking in the game I unfortunately play everywhere I walk in is like, where are the people of color? Can I get past 10 today? That is a constant scanning that we do all day, every day. Connect with other Black and brown folks that are here. See how you connect, particularly if you live here, which I'm assuming most of you do. Try to connect otherwise. Connect other people to other people. Because that's where the movement building is going to happen. It's going to happen as far as relationships. It's not going to happen where we just have panel discussions, and I appreciate the next time and this afternoon we're going to talk about what do we do next. How do we move past talking? But how do we create the community when we get outside of this space? Because when shit's going to hell, I'm cursing in the church, like it is right now, we need each other. We need people that look like us, that are in this fight for us, and they're going to, and that folks that are not part of our communities are going to listen to us about what we need and not become defensive and not shut down and not derail and not be fragile as hell. Humanists, next month at the American Humanist Association, Robin DiAngelo is going to be talking about white fragility and how it plays out in our secular communities. We have to talk about these things. So, with that, I think I've gone over my time because thank you for having me this morning, and I look forward to speaking to you this afternoon.
Good morning. Whew. Thank you, Sister Diane. We're fighting for our lives. We are fighting for our lives. I'm going to be talking about educational justice. How many of you went to public schools, have a child in public schools, work in public schools, or live in communities that are anchored by public schools? Okay, well, I'm glad to see that we have a robust representation here. If Donald Trump, Betsy DeVos, and their criminal thug band of reverse Robin Hoods get their way, then public education as we know it will effectively cease to exist. Earlier this week, some of you may be aware that Trump has proposed a radical school choice budget that redirects billions of dollars from Title I to vouchers, private schools, and charters, that slashes millions of dollars to the Office of Civil Rights, to teacher training programs, to after-school programs, to college readiness programs, to health care for very poor students. And this bloody swath will effectively reverse years of gains in educational justice. And this is not to say that public education is not rife with deep systemic challenges, but rather to offer, in light of this climate, in light of these atrocities, a full-throated, progressive, Black feminist, humanist defense of the remarkably woke young people, the activist students, and the activist teachers that power public schools and public education, often unrecognized and unappreciated. I am coming to the end of a school year where the 9th and 10th grade young activists that I've been teaching and mentoring and learning from over the past several years are going to walk the stage and graduate. And many of them are the first in their families to go to college. And they will do so in a climate where they might be the only person of color sitting up in their lectures. They may never have a professor or a dean who looks like them. They are leaving the hyper-segregated community of South LA to these hyper-segregated white supremacist campuses where they are under siege. So I veer between a sense of mourning and celebration for them, both hopeful and fearful for their futures. This is the first mixed-gender, predominantly African-American cohort of young people that has laid a foundation for feminist intersectional change at their school campuses. They're spearheaded peer education training on sexual harassment and sexual violence prevention, on pushing back against anti-sexism and rape culture, and the policing and victim blaming and victim shaming and slut shaming of girls of color. Most recently at an intersectional feminists of color youth conference that was convened in South LA that included male allies for the first time. And many of these young people have gone through 4 years of high school where they have seen up close the brutal devastation of prison pipelining, where scores and scores of their peers have been locked up in juvenile facilities and adult facilities, have been over-policed and assaulted on campuses that are governed by racist, zero-tolerance discipline policies. And this is a climate in which we see a deepening sexual abuse to prison pipeline. The sexual abuse to prison pipeline disproportionately targets African-American girls for suspension, expulsion, and push-out. African-American girls, cis, straight, queer, trans, have some of the highest rates of domestic sex trafficking in the United States, and yet this is under the radar of mainstream educational public policy. And so yes, public education and public schools are rife with deep and systemic institutional challenges, but these challenges, as many of us have seen, have been exploited by a cynical school choice regime, a reactionary right regime, and their democratic allies who are pouring billions and billions of dollars into charters, who are profiteering off of the desperation often of communities of color and families of color. So in the Los Angeles Unified School District, for example, the community where I come from, charter shills have captured a majority of the school board. And this is after a bruising election that saw, again, millions of dollars being poured into it by the charter lobby. Numerous studies have shown that charters effectively resegregate. Why? One, because they have become the playground. They have become the vehicle for white billionaires like the Gates Foundation, the Walmart Foundation, and the Broad Foundation, again, to capitalize and profiteer off of the undermining of public education. Two, charters do not have to accept everyone. They cream the best students. They exploit a non-unionized teacher workforce. They do not serve the needs of students with disabilities and English language learners and queer and trans and gender non-conforming students. And they often underperform traditional public schools. So this is not to vilify all charters. There are meaningful charters, there are culturally responsive charters, we know, but simply to say that charters are emerging in this context of the gross undermining and the gross dismantling of the public compact of providing, quote unquote, equitable opportunity for all. They are emerging in this climate where we have this gross intersection of economic inequality and neoliberalization and white supremacist disenfranchisement of the bodies and the lives of young people of color. So the proliferation of charters is a symptom of the decades-long divestment from reinforcing and replicating public schools that actually work. One that I work at called King Drew Medical Magnet, which is in South LA, near Compton, and it's predominantly African-American and Latino. It's a culturally responsive school with social justice leadership, and it sends more African-American and Latino young people to four-year colleges and universities than any other school in that district. But schools like this are never mentioned in the litany of inner-city horror stories that the GOP likes to trot out in order to galvanize its God and guns, white supremacist base, in order to galvanize one percenters like DeVos and keep them writing checks. And we know that the linchpin of the Christian rights privatization scheme is the destruction of racial justice in public schools and the circumvention of Brown v. Board via vouchers in private religious schools and charters. And there were many within the white secular humanist community who decried DeVos's religious bigotry, blogs and articles, but none of these pundits identified the fact that DeVos's policies will radically ramp up the very prison pipelining that is disenfranchising and pushing out young people of color. So back in the day, we used to call push out dropout or disengagement, implying that somehow students of color who do not see themselves represented in their school curricula, who routinely go to school and are brutalized and harassed and violated by school police, so-called school resource officers, that these young people somehow make an active choice to leave school rather than being pushed out by systemic forces of inequality and white supremacy and disenfranchisement, heterosexism, and homophobia. That has been the narrative, that somehow we have all of these pathological young people of color who are just leaving school because they are disengaged, rather than the system is disengaging and dehumanizing them. And so a scholar and activist, Monique Morris, who's the author of Push Out, Criminalizing Black Girls, has noted, push out takes the form for black girls of them being branded and stereotyped as not conforming to the norms of white gender expectations, of them not being ladylike and feminine. Push out takes the form of trans and queer and gender nonconforming African American students being criminalized in school, being harassed in school, and then being disproportionately sex trafficked and disproportionately becoming homeless because we don't have the mechanisms in our public schools to provide them with the mental health and the social resources that they need to stay in school and succeed in school. If we're looking at the stats in Minnesota, in St. Paul, a disproportionate number of African American and Native American young people are being pushed out of school, are being overrepresented in those who are suspended and expelled. And so here in Minnesota, push out looks like Native young people being caricatured and branded as hostile and incorrigible and ineducable because they are speaking their indigenous languages. It looks like in California, the suspension and expulsion disparities being driven by these insidious policies like willful defiance. And willful defiance for many years was the mechanism to push out African American students in particular. It refers to students who are quote unquote acting out, or who are talking back, or who are wearing so-called ethnic hair, or not conforming to normative dress codes. And so we have scores and scores of young African American and Latino and indigenous folk in LA County and in California at large who've been pushed out simply because they are not conforming to the norms of the dominant culture school system. And so activists have rallied around rescinding willful defiance in LA County and rallied around rescinding it within the state of California. LA County has the dubious distinction of having the largest juvenile prison population in the nation. It also has a dubious distinction of having the largest homeless population in the nation, which is predominantly African American, both youth and adult. And so in response to this crisis, the Youth Justice Coalition, who is one of the partners with the Women's Leadership Project just recently for our Feminist Youth of Color Conference, proposed creating a youth development department which would redirect a whopping 5% from LA City and LA County's police suppression and mass incarceration budget to youth jobs, to youth educational opportunities, and youth recreational opportunities. Nationally, activist organizations have been pushing back against the billions and billions of dollars that are being spent on school police, on paramilitary hardware, and surveillance systems to monitor students. So in LA County, for example, we have students that will just be randomly searched on a daily basis on any given campus. And so these billions and billions of dollars that are being misappropriated into the architecture of incarceration has undermined restorative justice programs, culturally responsive teaching programs, and of course, counseling. There's a whole movement called hashtag college, not prisons, counselors, not prisons. And so the issue is restorative justice is a humanist alternative to traditional punitive discipline, but of course it's elicited a lot of backlash from the zero tolerance regime, as well as teachers' unions who view it as being too touchy-feely and not able to fully address what they perceive to be the epidemic of student misbehavior. Restorative justice is based upon holistic approaches to reconstructing schools so that they are responsive to the needs of student activists, to reconstructing schools so that students can be agents within their school communities and not expendables. So it relies upon approaches like safe space creation and relationship building and culturally responsive teaching and social justice leadership. Nationally, the Dignity in Schools campaign, which I'm a part of, has called for a moratorium on suspension and expulsion and the implementation of restorative justice in nationwide school systems. There have been a lot of viral videos on the targeting and over-disciplining of African-American girls and the roughhousing and brutalization of African-American girls that have brought to light this intersection of gender and race when it comes to disproportionalities in suspension. There is this widespread belief that somehow disproportionalities in suspension only apply to African-American boys, when in fact African-American girls are 6 times more likely than are white girls to be suspended and expelled. And again, cis African-American girls, trans African-American girls, queer, gender nonconforming African-American girls. And so as a result, the National Women's Law Center recently launched a hashtag Let Her Learn campaign that spotlights the impact of these disproportionalities on African-American girls and provides strategies for activist communities within schools to push back and to challenge these practices and these policies. And so even as African-American girls, again, are 6 times more likely to be pushed out than white girls, their numbers in college are skyrocketing. And yet, this dream of going to college for African-American students is a distant one because of the decline of college preparation and college readiness. And it's eclipsed by high-stakes testing and more criminalization and more police presences on campuses. In California, for example, only 20% of African-American and Latino young people qualified to go on to the University of California and Cal State University systems. And so communities of color are in an all-out war with this brand of neoliberalism that's managed to seduce some parents of color with the talented 10th promise of deliverance from quote-unquote ghetto schools to charters and white-collar respectability. And so while white humanists can continue to focus on religion and secular freedoms in a vacuum, acting as though the election of Trump is the apocalypse, in reference to Sister Diane's slam down, in an environment where their children continue to be privileged in schools with fully funded STEM programs, AP classes, counselors, humanists of color must, as they say, stay woke because our futures depend on it, our lives, our bodies, and our right to self-determination depend on it. Thank you.
The T is not silent. Life's strange. Crimson sounds emanate from the darkness. Alert, you listen with an open heart. It is not your duty per se, yet, like sunrise, you always appear. Steady and sure on the turbulent rivers that in unison can create waves of energy that flow outward, leaving devastation in its wake. Swollen waters fill my lungs. I can't breathe. The light gets brighter and brighter, and all of a sudden I realize the beginning is near. I've been waiting for this moment for all my life. Oh Lord. Wow. It is my deep honor to share this stage with all of these amazing speakers today, and to address you in this conversation addressing the narrative of fear. As Senator Champion noted, I am running for city council in Minneapolis, the 8th Ward City Council seat, and as an unapologetic Black transgender woman, I think that deserves a round of applause, so it's okay. It's okay for you guys to applaud that. Thank you. Thank you very much. I never dreamed of this moment growing up in a working class family on the west side of Chicago with a single mother. And I do want to just shout out my mother who lives here in Minneapolis now. But when we were growing up in Chicago, like whenever our neighborhood would get really unbearable, or before it would become completely unbearable, she would always move us to a better neighborhood, to a better public school. My mom, you know, one of the big issues in African American wealth building is home ownership, and it is an extreme challenge today. But my mother, who had a high school education, has owned 5 homes, has never been foreclosed upon. She gifted myself and my sister each home so that we could move into home ownership. And in many ways, I really eschewed home ownership for a very long time. But you know, like Senator Champion talked about Isabel Wilkerson's book, The Great Migration, or Warmth of the Other Suns, which documented the Great Black Migration. My family came from Tuskegee, Alabama, to Chicago, and my grandmother was the woman in the book. If you read this book, there was the woman in Chicago who sort of became the, what would you call it, the beacon for families to come and to stay in their homes. That was my grandmother. Like, my grandmother owned a 3-flat, as we called them in Chicago. They call them triplexes here in Minneapolis. But family would come from the South, and they would stay with her until they got their footing and able to buy their own multifamily housing. So it's been a tradition in my family, and so I'm really thrilled that my mother has been able to pass that on to myself and my siblings, and hopefully I can pass it on to my children and grandchildren. So shout out, Mom. Yeah. So, wow. I moved to Minneapolis in 1979 to go to the University of Minnesota. And I had 3 solid years as a pretty decent student. I was engaged in a Greek letter organization, which shall remain nameless, but I eventually became president of that fraternity. But there were some internal struggles that I was dealing with around my gender identity. And those issues led to my being discovered and outed by my fraternity brothers, forcing me to leave school. And so for the next 10 years, I tried to hide from myself. I thought maybe I'm gay. And I lived in, quote, a gay lifestyle, but that didn't really fit. And then I got married and realized that that wasn't the answer either. It's so funny, you can run from yourself, but no matter how hard you try, you are always there, right? So at age 30, I came to terms with my identity that I knew existed since I was 4 years old, that I am a woman. I began going to therapy at the Program in Human Sexuality over at the University of Minnesota, and I finally came out to my family and friends, and I was sure that they would abandon me, that I would lose my job as a vocational counselor at Hennepin County. But the thing is, I didn't lose my job, because here in Minnesota, it was the first state in the union to have specific protections for transgender people in the Human Rights Act in 1993.